They're back. State lawmakers returned from their spring break. We'll go over all that they did at the Capitol this past week, coming up next on CapitolView. After about a month break, at least for members of the Illinois House, state legislators did return to business. I, for one, noticed a whole lot of tans, both in the General Assembly and from lobbyists. Sorry that I don't have one, guys. You're stuck with very white and glowing me. That would be Amanda Vinicky, State House Bureau Chief for Illinois Public Radio and WUIS FM in Springfield. We've got quite an awesome panel today. So right next to me here, University of Illinois Springfield, head of the Public Affairs Reporting Program, Charlie Wheeler. Also, Bruce Ruston of the Illinois Times in plaid, and the budget beard wearer himself, Chris Kaergard of the Peoria Journal Star. So thanks, everybody. It was a busy week, actually, at the State House, and maybe we'll get to some of why that is later. But I think the key term that people ask is, okay, they're back. Did they deal with the budget? And the answer to that is, shocker. No?
Not at all.
Anybody? Not at all. Okay.
Not that was apparent to anybody who was watching.
But we did have Republicans come out not once but twice, actually, during the week to publicly really chastise Democrats, and on Thursday to put forth a new plan they say would basically come to the rescue of social services. Chris Kaergard, can you talk a little bit about what that was?
Essentially, the proposal is, and there are longer-term pension reforms that they would include in this legislation, but they would take savings from a number of things, including shifting the burden for higher pension cost earners onto the governments that actually are employing those higher pension cost earners. In many cases, those would be state universities, which are already in a world of hurt from not having a budget of their own.
Right. And the goal
I think
of this
the other
would
one then would
be,
have to be the teachers' retirement system.
Yes.
Yeah.
Every public school teacher in the state of Illinois, except the ones in Chicago, are under the teachers' retirement system, and the cost, the employer cost, is not borne by the local school districts. Rather, the state picks up the cost for the local school districts. So if we were to shift more of that onto the local school districts, Chris, as you mentioned, universities would have a problem if they suddenly had to start paying more or anything towards their professors' pension benefits. But it would be a bigger burden, I think, on local school districts. Now, some school districts are in good shape, others are really hurting.
Well, and I think Republicans would say to that, well, then don't pay over $180,000 if that's what the governor's salary is, and that's what it would be. These employers would have to take on costs if somebody made more than that. Why is a school district superintendent making that much money?
And that's a fair question. If you're looking at it from the university angle, certainly there are those there who would argue that particularly for university medical schools, for some of the high-impact programs, whether that's engineering at the University of Illinois, the market commands those salaries for the real experts that have put those programs onto the map. Now, school districts, you've seen a lot of cost inflation in superintendent salaries over the last few decades there, particularly as people have moved from district to district and been able to command steadily higher salaries as they do so from the experience that they arguably bring to the job.
Yeah, and a lot of those are suburban school districts, particularly in some of the collar counties, where everything costs a lot, and where the local property wealth is so great that those kinds of costs could be absorbed without as much difficulty. I doubt that. Of
course, as the governor's calling for a property tax freeze, and ostensibly raising school costs could raise.
Yeah, it's all related, but
right.
But my guess is that the school superintendent isn't making 180 grand in Peoria, right?
Not quite yet.
and I don't think Dr. Gill here in Springfield is. Or probably most in central Illinois aren't making that kind of money. It's the suburbs where the big dollars are.
But those are also, I mean, high-profile things where they make good sound bites. But that's not the bulk of it. Let's be clear. I mean, it's the worker bees, quote unquote, that are the big question here. It's the teachers that are making, you know, regular type money.
Well, so Republicans say that they've tried time and time again. Everything they do, they want to attach some. If you're going to spend money, they want it attached to savings or a way to pay for it. And I know, Charlie, you have some deep thoughts in terms of it's not going to save that money right away, or it won't even. It's not even enough to pay for what they're trying to spend. It's not as if it's apples to apples in terms of cost to spend. It would basically be $1.3 billion of spending going to social services that have been holding out for it. Republicans likewise have a plan they say would fund universities, fund all of the four-year institutions as well as community colleges if and only if Democrats get on board with some procurement changes that would save money, save schools money. But Democrats haven't had an appetite for any of those things. This pension thing also includes Senate President Cullerton's consideration proposal, which Republicans say Democrats passed that in the Senate last time. What is the holdup? Are Republicans on fair ground here where they say we need to make some consideration for controlling costs if we're going to spend money?
I think it's got to be part of a bigger solution that involves revenue as well as cuts. For example, building into a budget for this year, which we're already 3/4 of the way through, or next year, savings from whatever kind of pension changes you're going to make, you're not going to see those dollars immediately. They're not going to do anything to cover the deficit here and now. The Comptroller's Office said as of yesterday, we were $6.8 billion in terms of the bill backlogs, bills that are sitting there that we just don't have the money to pay. You're not going to be able to address that making changes in the pension system because whatever legislation passes is certain to be litigated, and you won't know whether it is going to save you anything until you find out from the Supreme Court ultimately if in fact it squares with the constitutional protection of pension benefits.
And any of those larger savings are in the out years anyway, regardless of the plan.
Yeah.
I'm still confused. What is it about, say, procurement? I know I have talked to university administrators that say this is something they want. Why aren't Democrats willing to move on that? Does anybody have a good answer?
I think Democrats are looking to do everything at once and not do stuff piecemeal, and they want to have revenues as part of the picture, because everybody who looks at this, from people like the Civic Federation in Chicago, who are hardly tax and spend liberals, to the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, which is more a tax and spend operation, the Institute of Government and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois, just about everybody who seriously looks at it says the state can't continue on with our current revenue structure to be able to fund the services that people tell pollsters day in and day out they want to keep: education, human services, healthcare, public safety, those kinds of things. So we're going to need more money. And I think what the Democrats would like to see is where people come around and decide, okay, here's how much we're going to raise the income tax. Here's what we might do with the sales tax base. It'd be conceivable mathematically to actually lower the sales tax rate if you expanded the base wide enough and you bring in more money.
Something we could see. That'd be something they could bring home to voters.
You know, I thought that Ronner frankly missed an opportunity here by going out and doing something unprecedented, which on his budget address, why not introduce a budget that everybody knows it's always going to be DOA. But why not this time have introduced one which this is a realistic budget? This is, I've taken a look at it, I've changed the tax structure, and kind of done what Obama has done on a national level with the Supreme Court, give them a nominee and dared them to reject them. Come up with a realistic budget, because even Ronner acknowledges that there's going to have to be a change in revenue structures at the very least, and likely a tax hike. Since everybody knows it, the governor, I think, missed a chance, frankly, to get out in front of that and have folks having to respond to him and be, frankly, a leader on this.
The diehard Republican base might have admired that, but it could have seen progress and people's jaws would have dropped.
People's jaws would have dropped, and I don't think the Republicans would have been that against it, because I'm not sure that a lot of Republicans are in love with what's going on right now.
Well, especially in their districts, if you're representing a university that's talking about closing down WIU, EIU, CSU, and really a mess.
Right, and we're continuing to see a lot of that quiet dissatisfaction build, although at the news conference Thursday, Leader Durkin was asked about that and sort of danced around the specific question of how many Republicans, particularly downstate Republicans, have started to become a little more wary of just lockstep supporting the governor. I want to hit on one other thing that's interesting too. Charlie, you mentioned the prospect of Democrats wanting to do sort of a grand bargain deal, folding everything in, and it's very difficult to do that when there's been no discussion of a grand bargain and no leadership.
No discussion, period.
Right.
And part of it, I think, too, is there's this kind of whole toxic political atmosphere where the corrosion from D.C. has seeped into Illinois, where anybody who even mentions the subject, people on the other side of the aisle automatically jump on him. Was it in December when Speaker Madigan spoke to some group in Chicago? Was it the Civic Federation? No.
He was at the City Club of Chicago.
At the City Club. And somebody asked him a question, well, where would you start on income taxes? And he said something like, well, 5% might be a good starting point.
He was even kind of joking, actually. If you really listen to it,
Yeah, but immediately the reaction was, tax hike, Mike. Yeah. And I'm thinking, oh man, this really helps. But they're just so unwilling to set aside partisan gain to be able to do what needs to be done. And that's what's dissimilar, which strikes me as being very different about today's atmosphere than it was all the years that I covered. When we enacted the income tax, it was bipartisan. When we raised the rate temporarily in 1983, it was bipartisan. When we raised it again temporarily in '89, it was bipartisan. When we kept that temporary one, it was bipartisan. The only one that has been totally partisan was late in 2010 when the Democratic majorities in the General Assembly increased it temporarily, which in retrospect probably was a mistake.
And so what we have here is exactly, Republicans say that all Democrats want is a tax increase, and Democrats have said, no, we do have supermajorities, but this has to be a bipartisan deal. They don't want to go it alone. They want to harken back to those days, maybe spread the wealth a little bit, spread the shame.
The supermajority, too, is at least a little bit of a misnomer in the House, if not only because the governor has been very successful in peeling off one from the one-vote supermajority in Ken Duncan, but also because there are a number of downstate Democrats who don't always go along with the Speaker, who are released by the Speaker knowingly on a number of roll call votes, whether that's on concealed carry, whether it's on the tax hike, where if you look at those roll calls, there were downstate Democrats who did not support them. So the notion that there is an unbreakable supermajority is really sort of a misnomer.
Well, yeah, and the way it would work out, and if you go back historically, all those tax increases and the enactment of the income tax that I mentioned, if you go back and look at the record and you compare who voted yes and who voted no, and how did they fare the next time they were up for election, people who voted yes to enact the income tax, to increase the rates, on average got elected at a better rate than people who voted no. The exception being Governor Ogilvie, who proposed it and who was...
Well, you had to go statewide, but oftentimes you're voting for a tax increase if you're in a safe-ish district.
Oh, sure, and that's the reason, because it's bipartisan, and they say, well, Bruce, you might have a tough time in November, you get a pass. Chris, you're a safe Republican, you vote for it. Amanda, you're a safe Democrat, you're going to be on. And they put together what's called a structured roll call.
It's a pragmatic politics.
Yes.
But I mean, you look at the map. I mean, you know, how many competitive races are there? I mean, 4? You know,
yeah,
something
not
like
very
that.
many.
Yeah.
As things stand right now,
but they'll all be really expensive.
But they'll all be really expensive.
As
soon as the other one just really got the money,
as
why
things
not
stand
spend
right
it?
now, there are at least 31 Senate Democrats who will be back next year, and there's a majority of the House, not of either party, but there's a majority of House members who have no opposition in November. And you might say, well, there's still an opportunity for an independent to file or for someone to, the political parties to fill that vacancy.
Historically, that just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Well, I went back and I actually looked, because I'm sort of a nerd. And from 2000 on, there have been 164 people added after the primary, either by the party officials in the district or by write-ins. Guess how many of them actually won in November?
0.
0, exactly. And only about 2 dozen of them even got to 40% of the vote.
Well, but let's get back to something that you mentioned. So we did have Republican leaders come out and say, the governor also, he'd said he only wanted to meet one-on-one with Madigan, that apparently now an all four leaders meeting is the thing, whatever. Point being, they haven't all gotten together. There's clearly no from on high bipartisan resolution or even conversation. The governor says he's given 18 separate dates or time slots, and yet hasn't heard anything back from the Democratic leaders. It does appear as if he and Cullerton may have had a conversation. Really, this is all about House Speaker Michael Madigan, whose spokesman will only say no development. So what is that? Was there a call made? Is Madigan just not admitting it? Do they? And how do you move out of this if they don't talk?
Well, Bruce Rauner is like the guy who's calling up somebody for a date who's too busy ironing their cat to pick up the phone. That's really what this is. Madigan isn't going to. It's not to Madigan's advantage to meet with the governor right now. He is going to wait till the governor has to come crawling to him, and that's what really. I mean, that's what history I think has shown us. And you know, Rauner has certainly engendered not a lot of goodwill with this House Speaker. So I don't see, you know, Rauner recently ran an opinion piece in the State Journal Register this week saying, please meet, please meet. It's like, now this is embarrassing. And he's like, please date me, you know, and skywriting. and the Speaker's like, nope, not going to do it. And so, you know, frankly, you know, you can say, well, Madigan's not being very adult about it, but Rauner also helped create this situation.
Well, and you're absolutely right with the problems between those two, which is why the opportunity is ripe for the same sort of scenario to develop here that happened in Kansas that stopped a budget, forced shutdown there, the same thing that happened ultimately in Pennsylvania that got there to be a budget there, which is the rank and file finally stand up. Now, Illinois lawmakers have not been historically known for having a surplus of spine in that department and standing up to their leaders on much. But at the times it's happened, especially recently, it has worked. Child care last year is the most prevalent example of that with this particular fight, where moderate Republicans simply could not go along with that. They were getting absolutely socked back in their districts on it and quietly made it known, we can't hold the line on this. Now, if moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats were to start to make a separate peace and come together on something, unfortunately, I just don't know that that's very realistic.
Well, it could be if
and I thought it was kind of insulting of the governor to say one-on-one with Madigan and to forget about the Senate Republican leader, Christine Radogno, the House Republican leader, Jim Durkin. I mean, they're not chopped liver. They represent those caucuses. They represent the Republican presence in one of the branches of government.
Which may be why we got to change in tune.
Well, but yeah, and I mean, and you might say, well, they're a minority. They have no influence. That's not necessarily true. And again, this is going back. Well, this is going back a long way. But in 1983, Jim Thompson proposed a permanent increase in the income tax. The Democrats were on board. The House Republican leader in the minority, Lee Daniels, said no, it has to be temporary. What was enacted was a temporary tax increase because that was what Daniels wanted for the price of putting House Republicans on that bill.
Going to get people signed on.
So how long then do the House and Senate Republican leaders allow themselves to be disrespected in that way before they stand up to their governor?
But well, remember, this is a governor with a whole lot of money.
Because now he's talking about everybody getting together, which is the way it ought to be.
So a couple of things that maybe could change this dynamic if the rank and file rises up, if we see any action from Attorney General Lisa Madigan having to do that would halt employees' pay, that could bring about a resolution. Another thing that could change it would be perhaps if looking to the next year, you've got a lot of pressure from Republicans, sign a school budget and sign it as is. Democrats, and particularly by Democrats, I mean on the Senate side, saying no, only if the way that we fund schools is changed. Senator Andy Manar of Bunker Hill, Macoupin County there, has introduced a new plan, some slight variations from in the past. Anybody want to go through what those are?
I'll take a stab at it. I don't know. I've read it. The bill is 490 pages long. And again, being a nerd, I actually went through the whole thing.
I didn't.
Well, and one of the things, and this is kind of an aside, but when legislation is introduced, the bill is introduced that changes existing law, you have to set out the whole law that's being changed.
Right.
And you underline the new pieces. So what I did, I scrolled through looking for the underlines.
That's what I did too. It's a good trick. But anyway, so what it basically does.
Right now, we have a very complex formula. Menar's would be probably more complex. We allocate our general state aid to local districts based on 3 factors: based on the local property wealth, based on the number of students, based on the percentage of low-income kids. And we do it using those factors to determine how close to what is called a foundation level, $6,119, that we say statutorily, this is what assures an adequate education. And what Menard is suggesting is that some of these programs that are funded independently, some of the special education stuff, bilingual education, instead of funding them independently and have 6119 as the level for everybody, we should develop a foundation level for each individual school district, taking into account the demographics of the student population, how many poor kids are there, how many
bilingual,
non-English, how many bilingual, how many special ed, and then calculate this is what their weighting should be, and so here's what their formula should be. So maybe somebody would be 6119, some wealthy district up in the north suburbs. Maybe somewhere else what you need is going to be maybe 7,000 or 7,200, and then you would look at the local ability to raise, and then the state would fill the gap. So it's got more variables in it actually than the current formula, but it does have a more tailored approach, and it attempts to funnel money into the school districts that, for whatever reason, because of poor property values, because of a high incidence of low-income kids, need more money to be able to educate their students.
This measure would also allow, as we talked about earlier, the Chicago Public Schools, part of the employer pension cost to pay for teachers' retirement would be took on by the state, and any school that would be harmed by this measure would, their harm would be phased in over 4 years, and at least next year get a level amount of funding. That was done, Menard says, to really make it more palatable and more fair, but the quick reaction from Republicans was a no. Let's move on to something that I think can make it difficult for folks to stomach giving money to the government right now, as it's tax season, yay, when there's seeming corruption, or at least questions of that going on. Bruce, you've reported a lot on Auditor General Frank Martino. He did come before state legislators this week at a panel, and let me tell you, Republicans had some big questions for him. Bruce?
There are big questions, and I presume he answered all those questions, correct?
Oh, no. I believe
so, well, I'm glad you asked. Here's all the figures.
Was that it's a whole lot of paperwork going back years, and we'll have a response when it's ready.
That's a whole lot of the same answer to a question that's been pending since early January. And so let's look at what's happened instead of what the Auditor General says. The Auditor General has retained Bill Roberts as his lawyer. You don't retain Bill Roberts unless you think you've got some issues. I mean, Bill Roberts is a former state's attorney here in Sangamon County, former U.S. attorney, former general counsel to Governor Jim Edgar. He's a heavy hitter. And so that to me indicates that Frank Martino might have some issues. Now exactly what those issues are, we can't really say because he's not saying. But when you refuse consistently to answer questions, when you retain somebody who's got a background in criminal law, and that person's background in criminal law extends to the U.S. government, connect the dots as you will.
Yeah, and I think we should point out this has to do with the campaign funds that he had when he was a state lawmaker from where, Spring Valley?
Spring Valley,
exactly.
Yeah, which is in the
Illinois he's new at being Auditor General.
Right.
Yeah, he took over the office in January. So at the moment, what he's facing has nothing to do with the Auditor General's office. It's all
except
about
for
his
credibility.
past life. Well, yeah, but I mean in terms of the criminal charges aren't going to be.
But people are saying, how do you audit the state if you can't keep your mileage record?
And it's interesting because there's so little attention paid to any of the campaign fundraising, campaign spending for people who are not in typically targeted Tier 1 races. Martino was for years in a very safe seat. His last election was much closer than I think he had anticipated going into it. He won within a couple hundred votes. But prior to that, he was always a shoe-in in that district. I don't think anybody ever really gave a solid look to what he was raising, what he was spending it on.
And it's pretty
as a matter of fact, when he was appointed Auditor General,
and if there was a simple answer to these questions, we'd have heard it by now. So that indicates that there probably is not a simple answer to these questions.
And I was going to point out too that the Auditor General is not elected statewide. He's appointed by the General Assembly, and if I'm not mistaken, there were very few, if any, people who voted in the Senate or the House who voted against Mount
There were a couple of
nomination.
I think there were
Republicans,
10
but-
votes total.
Yeah,
But that was mostly on an
overwhelming
unrelated
support.
issue.
Sure, and you know, let's be clear here. It's a 10-year appointment, and so it's not like he has to answer these questions because he's afraid these are going to get voted out of office. That's off the table. He has to answer these questions, I think, because at some point it starts spilling over to the General Assembly and whether this was a wise choice that they made, and perhaps maybe they should rethink that if it's possible.
Now,
And even more than that, as you were saying earlier, it has to do with the ability to be able to rely on the audits as being, you know,
Above
platinum
board,
level.
truthful,
Yeah,
right.
platinum level. And in my mind, the audits that Auditors General,
Yeah.
have prepared over the years since the office was first created back in, well, I think 1971 by the Constitution. They've been totally reliable.
And now this brings that into question.
And-
I want
and
to
so
talk
now
about
there's
another
this
quick
question.
fall from grace because we've only got 2 minutes left here. So, Bruce, real quick, we have former U.S. House Speaker Denny Hastert. This week we did see some reporting about why it is that he is in trouble. And did he make an apology?
I don't know that he's really come forth and truly apologized. The Chicago Tribune ran a story, I believe it was today, just devastating. Just levels him, and it really isn't that surprising, you know, given if we know the background of this, that these payoffs that he made were to buy somebody silence whom he had had inappropriate sexual contact while the person was a minor, and so now there's apparently 4 that the Tribune has identified. It's just sad. It's disgusting. It's a huge fall from grace. It cuts to the core, and it's ruined his name probably
He
for
seems
forever.
to be asking for leniency given age.
Everybody
before
does
House.
when they're before the judge.
Yeah, asking to be judged on the entirety of his career. Now, I was actually just up in his former district, and just sort of the hushed tone people take when mentioning him, a huge disappointment.
Well, and we're about to wrap up here. I did mention the hairiness that is going on Mr. Kaergard's face. Chris, real quick, can you explain what is that? How long has this been going?
I stopped shaving May 31st when the legislature didn't pass a budget. I am not shaving this fiscal year until they do. If they do manage to pass it, or if they don't by June 30, we'll do a charity fundraising shave on this to try to get some money back to the agencies that have lost it.
Just got to be raffling off
Somebody's going to buy your beard.
to shave Chris.
to take
You can put it in a box and give it to and separate it. One for the governor, some for the speaker.
If only it wouldn't be judged a biohazard.
Well, who knows when we'll see a clean-shaven Chris Kaergard, but perhaps we'll cover that here on Capitol View. Thanks so much to the Peoria Journal Stars, Mr. Kaergard, as I said. Also, Bruce Ruston of the Illinois Times, Charlie Wheeler of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at the University of Illinois Springfield with Illinois Public Radio and WUIS. I'm Amanda Vinicky. Check us out on Facebook, Capitol View Politics.